Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Carrillo Gantner Theatre at the University of Melbourne for the 2015 A.N. Smith Lecture in Journalism. My name is Glenn Davis, and on behalf of the University of Melbourne, it is a delight to welcome such a large and distinguished crowd. I begin, of course, by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we meet, and pay respects to elders past and present. It's a very great pleasure to be introducing tonight's lecture and tonight's lecturer, Sarah Ferguson. But let me acknowledge a number of distinguished guests, including, importantly, the 2014 A.N. Smith lecturer, Maurie Schwartz and Anna Schwartz. Welcome. It was a wonderful year last year, as it will be tonight. And a warm welcome to the many professional colleagues from the media, from academia, from across the university, and a particular warm welcome to the journalism students who are here in the audience tonight. The Masters of Journalism offered through the Centre for Advancing Journalism is a wonderful program, and it's great that so many of you are here. Now, my colleague, Dr. Margaret Simons, will play the main role for the university in curating what happens later in the evening, but you can join in. The hashtag is #ANSmith. So feel free to live tweet the lecture all the way through. This is a series that began before you could do that. It was made possible by a bequest from the family of the late Arthur Norman Smith, one of Australia's leading political journalists from the era of Federation through to the early decades of the 20th century. He was a founder of the Australian Journalists Association, and his family wished to honour his long-standing professional contribution by making a bequest, quote, to provide a lecture by a leading authority on some important aspect of journalism. The first of these series was held in 1938, and so distinguished lecturers over many decades have contributed to this fine set of public lectures. But tonight we are delighted to be welcoming Sarah Ferguson, who brings an extraordinary balance and range of experience to the role. She was educated at King's College London. She began journalism with the Independent newspaper. She moved, as we all dream of doing, to Paris at the age of 23, where she worked as a television researcher and production assistant in the film industry. She moved to Australia in the 1990s, where she worked for SBS programs Dateline and Insight, and later on Channel 9's program Sunday, before joining the ABC, where she's broke many stories with Four Corners and conducted extraordinary, memorable interviews with leading political figures for documentary programs such as The Killing Season and as the host of the 7:30 Report. Commenting on her 7:30 Report interviewing, one critic in the Sydney Morning Herald said, and I quote, "Ferguson is not ferocious or pushy or bossy. She's in fact unyielding, determined and precise," which is high praise from the critical press. She has won multiple Walkley Awards, including the Gold Walkley in 2011. She's also won 4 Logies and, importantly, the Queensland Literary Award, amongst her many distinctions. We're delighted to welcome her to the university to present the 2015 A.N. Smith Lecture in Journalism. Please make welcome Sarah Ferguson.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, and a particular thank you to the Centre, not just for inviting me, but for chasing me for a long period of time. I was making a series, have been making a series, still am making a series on domestic violence. I have been living in a women's refuge in Western Sydney, and for most of that time chose not to have my phone with me so I could focus and not tweet and constantly look at updates of things. So I was an absolutely useless correspondent to Margaret Simons here, who very generously persevered and then persevered with the arrangements. So a particular thank you, because without that, I definitely wouldn't have made it, and I wouldn't wanted to have missed this for anything. And I remember Mark Scott, I asked him for a little bit of advice as a previous lecturer, and it was actually watching you all come in that reminded me of this, that he said, remember, it's Melbourne, so a little bit more intellectual than Sydney, I think. So let's see if I can manage to meet Mart's expectations, and also Maurie last year, who gave such a brilliant lecture. So when I started, when Margaret asked me to give this lecture for the Centre, I was particularly exercised about transparency, the putative title of tonight's lecture, and I will talk about that. But since then, in the weeks that followed, of course, we've gone through an extraordinary political change in this country. There have also been convulsions in politics in the United Kingdom. So I want to add those ideas and start by talking about the possible effect of those convulsions on our media here. I have just come back from the United Kingdom. That's where I come from, although actually I come from Lagos in Nigeria. So I hope if I'm ever subject to a deportation order, anything's possible these days, that they kindly send me back to my mother's house in Essex and not to Lagos in Nigeria. So that's where I've been, in the relative comfort of the home counties, watching, this won't mean anything to the audience here, but watching the great victory of Australia over England in the rugby. So I know very well that I have affection for the home team, but I also had the chance while I was in England to watch the Labour Party conference, the first Labour Party conference of the new leader, Jeremy Corbyn, the extraordinary anachronistic throwback, you might say. Some people said he's either your best friend or he's a defrosted member of the Politburo, depending on which papers you read. Now, Corbyn was chosen precisely because he's not the classic retail politician. Coming from the hard left, he's philosophically about as hard and about as far removed, I should say, rather, from Tony Blair as it's possible to be and still be in the same party. As we know, the seeds that Tony Blair cast off grew in stony ground, revealing these bonsai characters, these gnarled versions of himself that the British public saw through and eventually cast off. Now, in desperation, it was at that time that they turned to Corbyn. Of course, he promised at that point a brand new style of politics. But then along comes the Labour Party conference, and what do we see? But a slogan. Straight-talking, honest politics was plastered all over the conference centre, a hostage to fortune, I thought, if ever I've seen one. Anyway, at least he had 4 words in his slogan, not just 3. Now cometh the hour, and there's Jeremy Corbyn about to give his keynote speech. Now, I'll leave him there for a minute, staring rather glassy-eyed into the auto-cue, just to mention one of my favourite podcasts, which is the BBC's News Quiz. Now, this is proof, if ever we needed it beyond Jon Stewart, that politics these days is better viewed through satire than through the reality of politics. And I'm sure that Arthur Smith would appreciate this digression into politics, going on what Glyn said. You know, so often these days, punchlines are delivered by real politicians, but they look as if they've come from the hand of Armando Iannucci, the writer of The Thick of It and Veep. I'm sure you're all followers. Think of Nope, 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 you know, the other Tony Abbott slogan that never ended up on the billboard. It's the kind of territory that the News Quiz traverses every Friday night. And last Friday, sitting in my mother's sitting room looking over the fields, they began with this question. What is the only red thing that Jeremy Corbyn doesn't like? Some of you know what happened. The answer, as it transpired, was the auto-cue. Corbyn was halfway through his keynote speech, and obviously this is a very important moment for him. He's the new leader. And by the way, a journalist, a sharp journalist, God bless us, in the audience, noticed very quickly that there was a passage in that speech that had been written for a Labour leader in 1985. So a throwback indeed, written and rejected by that leader and every leader since. Anyway, Corbyn ploughed through that section of the speech and then arrived at a moment where there was a message in the auto-cue to help him with his delivery. Strong message here. It advised him, strong message, underlined, strong message here! It's the sort of stuff-up that, of course, satirists love. One of the News Quiz comedians said it could have been worse. He could have been saying, we must invest in young people and lean forward sincerely. Now, I imagine you would quite reasonably be asking me at this point why I've started by talking about the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. We're, after all, an Australian audience. And one reason alone, of course, is that if Bill Shorten falls badly at the next election, fails badly, the ALP, I should say, might just be looking for its own version of Corbyn. I've just noticed something. I haven't given a speech for a while, and my eyesight, this is the moment where I knew I had to get glasses, so I'm just going to pick them up a little bit. Now, of course, as well as that, the warp and weft of British and Australian Labour politics has included many common threads in recent decades. We followed them. The young Tony Blair, as you know, was inspired by Hawke and Keating. When Blair rose to power in Britain and Labour went fallow in Australia, Kevin Rudd looked to 10 Downing Street for inspiration. In fact, in some ways you could say Kevin Rudd picked up the Blairite banner, some of his slogans, indeed some of his policies, and carried those into government on a wave of optimism. We know where that ended up, and I'll come to that in a moment. But for now, Tony Blair's New Labour project is dead and buried where it began in Britain, and Jeremy Corbyn is the stake through its heart. Now, Corbyn, you may know, is deeply distrustful of the mainstream media, which is why I think he's interesting to watch. Not only the tabloids that disparage him for his clothes, even for his mode of transport, accusing him of having a Chairman Mao-style bicycle, but he's also equally distrustful of the BBC. But if Corbyn's history of antagonism towards the BBC has implications, they are nothing compared to the Tories, and that may be the lesson that we need to take from British politics today. The world's first and biggest and probably still the best broadcaster in the world is under threat. The BBC is facing the biggest challenge in its history, and it comes from a government led by a moderate, liberal-minded Tory Prime Minister David Cameron, a man, we should note, in the same mould as our own new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, philosophically aligned as they are, with their views on climate change, gay marriage, innovative capitalism. After his unexpected victory, as we know, David Cameron, free from the shackles of coalition, is free to do what he wants. Now, the first day after his new cabinet sat, the Telegraph, the British broadsheet, shouted a headline, "Tories go to war with the BBC." The general in this campaign of David Cameron's is the new Culture Secretary, John Whittingdale, a former private secretary to Margaret Thatcher. Whittingdale denies he's at war, but he said this: "The BBC needs to be made fit for the new broadcasting age we are moving into, made fit." Whittingdale is going to oversee a root and branch review that will reconsider the scope and purpose of the BBC, the definition of public broadcasting, its independence and its funding. Even in the last 24 hours, Whittingdale has opened up a new front against the BBC by saying the BBC will be stripped of its right to adjudicate allegations of political bias. This comes on top of a leaked Green Paper questioning the impartiality of BBC News, particularly in the coverage of the last election. Now, how familiar does all of this sound? Under Australia's previous Prime Minister, all indications were they were gearing up for a similar war against the ABC. Now, when the killing season aired, Tony Abbott stood up in Parliament, threw his arms in the air, turned to the press gallery and said, "Thank you to the ABC. I don't normally say thank you to the ABC, but I have to say Australia is indebted to you in this instance." Now, this followed very closely on one of the government's most intense assaults on the ABC, on the Q&A programme. The Prime Minister, if you recall, went on to forbid his ministers to appear. As we know, just the latest in a long series of assaults by the then Liberal leader, who had accused ABC journalists of being unpatriotic, of taking everyone's side but Australia's, of lacking basic affection for the home team, and I've already demonstrated I have that. Now, Barry Humphries, last week in The Australian, gave an interview and said, well, I'm pleased about this. He said he loved the killing season, but he also said it was very clear to him that it had been made to ingratiate the ABC with the government, to make up for our sins, if you like, a bit like the building of the Sacré-Cœur in Paris, built to expiate the sins of 19th century France. Of course, what these critics of the ABC fail to understand, that it is not the ABC's job to project the country according to their tastes, nor is it the ABC's role to boost or spruik for Australia in peacetime or in conflict. No one at the ABC, well, I say no one, I'd like to think it's no one, let's just hope it's no one looks to the government for thanks. But is it unreasonable that the government should have such a meagre understanding of an organisation it funds and an organisation for whom the public, year after year, clearly has such a great deal of trust? Now, since then, of course, since Tony Abbott's thanks for the killing season, we've had our great change at the top of politics. In the reshuffle that followed, what's the first thing we hear? Some clever person dug up some comments made by Mitch Fifield when he was in opposition, in which he said that the privatisation of the ABC is an idea which had merit. Now, he was interviewed, and very quickly Fifield said that he had been merely a frisky backbencher. I'd like someone to draw a frisky backbencher if they could while I speak. He went on to say that, as a government, we will make sure that the ABC is well-resourced to do the job that Australians want it to do, without defining what that job is. But I have a very clear idea in my working life what I think that job is. I try to make compelling stories for Australians, examining the exercise of power, giving voice to the marginalised, all the classic work of great journalists in the past. But the question for me is how successful we're going to be in the future. And that depends a lot on how we respond to the technical change around us, and also the growing pressure from governments, from organisations, and from corporations to restrict at every possible moment our access to information. A young woman was talking to me just before we started and asking me about this, and it just reminded me that even in my working life, how much that assumption has reversed, that the assumption that I am entitled to know something from an organisation has changed. And I was scolding her, if you like, about the notion that young students, and any of you in this room, should go into marketing and PR rather than journalism. So anybody who's thinking or doing marketing and you're a student at Melbourne University, please stop it immediately and go into journalism. Unless you're not very good, in which case stay right where you are. Now, in the light of this great leadership change, which befell us recently, I'm frequently asked when I'm going to start on The Killing Season Part 2. And actually, you know what occurred to me today? I thought I could ask George Miller if I could borrow his title and call it The Killing Season Fury Road. Because it's a battle to the death in a post-apocalyptic landscape where knowledge of water is crucial and there's a muscly female lead. So all the parts are there. Now, I could go a long way with that metaphor, but maybe at dinner. Now, of course, as we know, the new Prime Minister, his deputy, and the Treasurer, just like Gillard in 2010, they want to move on. They don't want to answer questions now about the machinations. They'll have to answer them sooner or later, but their story isn't over yet. It's too early to be asking young Wyatt Roy to go and sit on a bench in Lonsdale Street with a late model iPhone and do some reenactments. My question, for now, has a much more distant horizon. I noticed the head of Netflix, the streaming service, said there'll be no broadcast television in 30 years' time. And that's about the time, of course, that we will be getting ready to make the Wyatt Roy years or the Sam Dastyari season. But the question is, will they, or other future leaders, allow the ABC to tell their history, like John Howard did, like Hawke and Keating did, and as Rudd and Gillard did? Or will our future leaders not trust the ABC anymore, or the media, trust a media that they don't control? John Howard trusted the ABC with a 4-part series on his legacy. It's almost hard to imagine that now. Bob Hawke was always in favour of Labour in power. Paul Keating was more difficult, but eventually came round. Gillard and Rudd, their involvement in the killing season had many challenges, but both eventually agreed to take part fully and with nothing in return. There were no conditions on their involvement. Just leave aside for the moment the big questions about the future and how that series will be made and where we will see it and how it will be distributed. But the question is, for me, will they still allow us, will they still accept the idea that the ABC has a role in curating their history, or are they going to insist on only packaging their own versions and disseminating them on their own terms? You know, like professional sporting teams now, some politicians are already using in-house communications unit to generate content unfiltered by anyone except their advisors. Remember earlier in this year when Abbott went to Iraq, they left the crew in Dubai, ensuring that there were no questions on that particular trip. All the content was provided exclusively by the PM's own unit. The New South Wales Premier, Mike Baird, generates and posts his own content. The popular Premier has employed a former advertising creative to manage his networks. The question is, how far will they take this? And how far will their successors take the practice? It's already a practice, as we know, of corporations in distress. Look at the recent scandal in Europe with the emissions testing at Volkswagen. When Martin Winterkorn, around the time that that scandal broke, Martin Winterkorn from Volkswagen made a statement on the company website apologising, but he didn't put himself up for an interview. Now, it didn't save Martin Winterkorn, but it meant that in the moment of the heat of that crisis, there was no scrutiny available for anybody. But just step back a moment from the abyss. I just want to talk about the figures for the killing season. We don't normally want to talk about ratings, but they're instructive. 1.5 million people watched each episode, with a further 500,000 watching on iView. Its audience held throughout the series. It won its time slot, beating the commercial networks. It was the highest rating ABC programme in its time slot since 2005. Miracle of miracles, it also scored well in the 18 to 24 demographic. I think there's a special badge or award for that at the ABC. So why did people watch? Obviously, crucial to its success for me was the fact that the narrative between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd was unresolved. The series contained within it, too, all the elements of drama that we love from box sets. Lots of ambition, no dragons, but lots of ambition, retribution, fieriness. It was also a series made for television by people who love the genre and understand it. Just like the BBC, the ABC pools its quality. So it was made by some of the best technical staff in Australia. Now, when I started, Paul Kelly's book, Triumph and Demise, was just about to come out. Much had been written and said about the period. One TV producer, whom I respect very much, asked me right at the beginning whether there was indeed anything new to say. Kelly's book was exhaustive, detailed, analytical, but I knew that Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard on screen together would be unmissable, both straining equally to assert their narrative. Both highly skilled television performers, Rudd with his theatrical timing, part vaudeville, part liturgy, and Gillard with her tightly calibrated answers, both of them capable of not answering a single question. Gillard's technique, I came to learn, is a firm answer to a question you haven't asked. Brilliant, that one. Rudd simply says he doesn't remember. But they were also both trained more, as I said, for the contest of ideas that takes place in a short interview. Over a longer interview, the anomalies emerge, and so patience, of course, becomes an extremely important tool for a television interviewer. I was telling Margaret about this earlier, I have my own private doghouse that anybody, and if you're in the room, you're one of them, who urged me to delve into Rudd and Gillard's private lives. Shame on you, all of you. Now, for me, a successful series also meant no trades, no deals, very few off-the-record conversations, and certainly no off-the-record information quoted in the programme. And as I said, to their credit, neither Rudd nor Gillard asked us for anything in return. We didn't get off to a good start, though. Now, I think I was still at 7:30, and I was just saying to that young student earlier on, the key to a good interview is preparation, and I was woefully unprepared. But the salient point of that meeting, we met Julia Gillard at the Hilton, and in fact somebody had organised a bedroom for us, which would have been very odd, the three of us, myself and the series producer, perched on the end of a bed. Anyway, I quickly found another meeting room, and Julia Gillard arrived, and I have never met an interviewee more hostile ever. We were really taken aback. It wasn't personal. It was because of her view, her very dark view of the media. And she urged me, and she wanted to know, before she would take part, whether or not we were going to examine the media's role, because in her view, it was so egregious during her time as Prime Minister that we couldn't do the series justice if we didn't do that. Rudd was similar. He had an equally jaundiced view of the media, particularly of the ABC. It did help that none of us came from the press gallery. Now, Rudd and Gillard, of course, there were echoing Tony Abbott's lines that he used on his departure, that we, as journalists, should refuse to connive at dishonour by acting as the assassin's knife, with that fabulous Rococo language of Tony Abbott's. Now, Gillard at least had the candour to admit that she had briefed journalists while she was Prime Minister. It was a sort of half concession, because she said she only did it to correct untruths from the Rudd camp. Kevin Rudd also admitted that he had briefed journalists, but it wasn't a particularly full admission. Greg Combet railed against the practice in his beautiful Anglo-Saxon invective, and Rudd's supporter Alan Griffin said that they were all doing it. Now, I don't wholly accept Abbott's characterisation of the media, or Gillard's, or Rudd's, but it did make me reflect on our relationship with politicians and how honest we are about the way their stories reach us as journalists, particularly I'm talking about here in the political field. Is it a culture that undermines the audience's trust in us? And I wish that Arthur was here, we could ask him about it and how it's changed. Gillard was much better prepared for her interviews, not least because she'd written her book, so she had organised her thoughts, if you like. Her performance was much more guarded, in my opinion, but much more even. Kevin Rudd had not spoken about the events, and he was initially very suspicious. In the first section of interviews in Boston, we made very slow progress. On the third day, he announced that he was flying to Saudi Arabia, quite a Rudd thing to do. So we cut short the interview, and our sound recordist, Rudd, in fact, turned to him and said, "Can you drive me to my hotel?" So the sound recordist, the American sound recordist, drove him through Boston. He said he'd never had such a terrible responsibility in his life. We took, I think, Rudd's jacket and tie and agreed to meet again in Sydney, because we were, by this stage, quite a long way behind. So just after Christmas, we set up at Gore Hill, which is the old ABC studio in Sydney. It's about to be sold, or was about to be sold, so empty corridors, empty makeup rooms, really full of the ghosts of the ABC past. We set up in a giant studio in the corner, 5 cameras, lots of lights. The makeup people came and went with their final powders. The cameraman made his last adjustments to the lights. Rudd flicked his hair. And I realised that he was extremely nervous that morning. And so I hurriedly wrote a note to the producer in the dark and passed it to her via the sound recordist. "He's in the zone. We have to go fast." So we started, and the first thing I said to him was, "Are you enjoying yourself?" To which he said no. And we used that section actually at the beginning of episode 2. But the point was, this was the day where we were discussing the leadership change. So I put allegation after allegation after allegation to him about the way he had managed the government in 2010. It was relentless. We moved on to the period after Julia Gillard became Prime Minister, and I asked him again and again about his role in undermining her. We got to lunchtime. Kevin Rudd retired to the green room and stayed there. Quite a long time passed. I went in to see him. He said, "It's like being in a witness box. Why am I the one answering all the allegations? I'm not doing it anymore. It's over." So at that moment, the series really hung in the balance. I left him to his own devices, and then all of a sudden, again, like a microcosm of Rudd in 2010, he suddenly perked up, put on his jacket, and marched back into the studio and gave quite a brilliant afternoon's interview. A little picture of Rudd. You know, Jenny Macklin said he would have geared up for the election in 2010. Julia Gillard said he couldn't, and we'll never know the answer to that question. This was really high-end television. You know, I've just been in the UK looking at what the BBC can still do, but this is in the same tradition. I'm not saying it's as good, but the thing, as I said about the ABC, is it collects talent. This is why you don't break it up, because of the collection of talent that's there. It wasn't grand, though. 5 of us jammed into a very small room with a lot of computers, keeping the room at a sort of steady 42 degrees through the making of it. 2 producers, 2 researchers, and me. They looked at 1,500 hours of archive. That's a conservative count. And we did more than 50 interviews, only 3 of which didn't make it to air. Now, I loved a lot of those interviews. There were many moments for me of clarity and also in a way of theatre. I particularly liked, if you've seen it, Ken Henry, because of the slow, thoughtful way in which he answered the questions, quite unlike a politician, of course. I asked him what he thought and what his views were about whether or not there was any justification in removing Rudd. We'd been discussing Kevin Rudd's failures of process in 2010. He said, "It's not what I thought at the time that there was any justification for removing him. And even in retrospect, I think that's not the question I've asked myself. The question I've asked myself is whether there should have been a deeper quality conversation with a man about what needed to change." I liked that, the deeper quality conversation. I mentioned that exchange also because we ran it at length. Now, the series was pretty pacey, but if you think about it, the episodes were long, 75 minutes for the first one, 90 minutes for the second, 75 minutes for the third. That second episode is that's two Four Corners back to back, and still nobody switched off. Now, I raise that because so much of the discussion we have around new media is around speed and the need for everything on the screen to move all the time. It has to change. We don't have the attention span to be able to follow anything less. And yet, in the middle of these very long episodes on television, we made the decision to run these very long excerpts. And again, I think the audience handles that much better than they're given credit for. But whatever, of course, that tells us about where the audience is today, because as sure as we don't know what's happening in the future, I think we have a poor idea about what's happening to us right now. But either way, that great twister of technology, whatever we do, it's roaring down the road towards us. You know from the speeches that you've had here in the last few years, including Mark Scott, that he's achieved a near impossible task, I would say, of driving a big, unwieldy, and sometimes bolshy, and that includes me, organisation, to be in a position where it won't just survive change, but should be able to profit creatively from it and keep its audience intact. Recall Malcolm Turnbull's words when he took over the leadership. I think you'll recognise with those strains, if you know the poem, the strains of Wordsworth's poem about the eve of the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. This is what Malcolm said. "There's never been a more exciting time to be alive than today, and there's never been a more exciting time to be an Australian. We need to be agile, innovative, creative." The same, of course, is true of journalism. He could have been speaking to us. That is, if, and this is the big if, we hold fast to the most precious commodities, unflinching rigour and credibility. Of course, it's those qualities that secures our place in the future. It's also perilous being a boundary rider in an era of violent change. As Scott pointed out, the gap between success and failure is very, very small. Consider how much things have moved since Mark stood here a few years ago. In May, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg did a deal to publish news directly into our news feeds. But who did Zuckerberg choose as his collaborators in this new venture? He didn't choose the gonzo investment blog we were discussing earlier, Zero Hedge. He chose the BBC, the New York Times, NBC, National Geographic, The Guardian, Spiegel, Bild, all of them trusted media names. At the same time, he also made an enormous $2 billion investment in Oculus Rift. So the tech writers will tell us the best of the new generation of virtual reality headsets. Beyond Oculus Rift, there's the $500 million investment by Google in Magic Leap, augmented reality. Now, Oculus Rift came out of a gaming culture, but Zuckerberg says he wants news applications for it, and that means us. Now, under Mark Scott's drive to put the ABC in a position to survive whatever is coming down the road, ABC R&D is asking us to consider as journalists and program makers how we can use these tools as part of our newsmaking. Now, I'm trying hard not to dwell on the idea raised by Graydon Carter recently in Vanity Fair that wherever virtual reality starts, cats and pornography will surely follow. When it comes to virtual reality, that's a truly horrible thought, and I don't mean the cats. But think about the news applications. Think about this. If you're as a consumer or a viewer, whatever you're going to be, you're walking through a virtual reality refugee camp in Syria, don't you still want an intelligent person as your guide, a curious person who's going to seek the truth, who's going to look for true human feelings beyond the sentiment, who's going to probe for anomalies, who's going to understand the context of what you're experiencing, narrow and broad. You don't want someone who thinks that what they're seeing is occurring for the first time in human experience and whose chief response is amazement instead of curiosity. Now, many of the stories I've been involved in, I think, would work very well in virtual reality. Imagine being in the cockpit of a Qantas A380 making a perilous landing in Singapore. Imagine walking through the ruins of a broken building in Bangladesh. Imagine the Asian tsunami rethought for virtual reality. Just about every story I can imagine, except perhaps the one on the cattle industry in Indonesia. However much we want a lived experience, I don't think any of us yet are ready for a 900-kilogram Brahmin bleeding to death in our living rooms. But that's about the only one I can think of. Maybe we don't yet want a politician doing a giant virtual selfie in their living rooms, but maybe we do. Now, whatever the tools, and it's good that the ABC has got us thinking about it, but whatever the platform, whether it's virtual reality, augmented reality, or the many unimagined tools that have yet to arrive, the key is still the same. Our ability to find an original, compelling story and tell that story in a way that enables the audience to trust what they see. Now, the same compact for an ABC journalist is always pushing into difficult, demanding territory. A well-funded public broadcaster will seek out the stories that a commercial broadcaster may not pursue, or certainly not at length. I went to Indonesia a few years ago with a colleague to follow a story of a young man making his fourth attempt to come to Australia. He'd been shot at, his boat had been sunk, he'd been imprisoned, re-imprisoned. We went there to make the story, and he pulled out on the second day, and it is a unique pressure, I can tell you, being overseas on a budget for Four Corners and your story has collapsed. We looked around and it became immediately clear to me that the other part of this story, which was the callousness of people smugglers, was a story that wasn't being told. And it was a story that the refugee advocates who had helped us set up the original story did not want us to tell. 3 years later, a long journey via travel agents in Iraq, perfume shops in Kuala Lumpur, ended up in a car park in Canberra with a notorious people smuggler pushing shopping trolleys. Now, a few days after the story went to air, the Australian Federal Police let him leave the country. At the time, a number of commentators wrote that I had performed a terrible disservice, that I had trampled on the toes of the AFP, and that the reporting was a disgrace. In Turkey, a few years ago, just before ISIS's blitzkrieg into that country, I was collecting evidence of secret prison camps run by Nouri al-Maliki against the Sunnis in that country. Now, at that time, Nouri al-Maliki was our ally in the fight against al-Qaeda. Should it have occurred to me whose side he was on, whose side I was on? Should that question have played any part in my questioning as a reporter? I would say not, nor were the considerations of the AFP my concern. Now, I think the same questions that I ask now are the same questions that we'll be asking in 30 years' time, or indeed in 100 years' time. I know that's a bold thing to say, but they're the same questions that the great journalists of the past asked about the work that they did. Now, one of my particular favourites is Vasily Grossman, a war correspondent, a Russian war correspondent, who spent longer at the front than anybody else, who wrote the most extraordinary account of Treblinka that became part of the Nuremberg trials. What is it that set Vasily Grossman apart as a journalist? He meticulously prepared. He was a patient listener. He was a product of the Moscow intelligentsia, but he was able at the same time to win over one of the best snipers at Stalingrad and spend time in a chilling prefiguring of the movie American Sniper, spend time in his killing nest. Now, Grossman understood the humanity of his subjects and the human experience of war. He also believed in the heroism of the Red Army, but when he joined the Red Army on the march to Berlin, he also made detailed notes. He couldn't have published this at the time, but he made detailed notes of the rape of German women along the way. He looked at his stories with an unflinching eye for truth. Nellie Bly is a female journalist I also admire. When she was 22 years old, 22 as a woman in the 1880s, she had herself committed to a mental asylum to experience firsthand the conditions. Now, I wonder if I met Vasily Grossman or Nellie Bly, what I would tell them about the work that I do. Would I be able to say that I give voice to the weak and marginalised in the way that Nellie did? Could I say that I try to have the same unflinching eye for truth? And the answer is clearly not as they did, but still I think I'm asking the same questions. Now, just before the killing season was over, in fact, the night of the second episode, I think, I was a very long way from the ABC. I just moved into the refuge that I mentioned at the beginning. I have to confess, I don't have much time for self-pity, but that night I did feel a little bit sorry for myself. I'd been working very hard for a long time, and I wanted to watch it go to air with my colleagues and enjoy the racket and noise that inevitably follows. Never mind that. The next story had swallowed me up, and that is, of course, what we want. We want the next story. We want to be swallowed up by what comes next. But even in this world, I found obstacles in the most unlikely places. Now, I compare the attitude of the women with whom I've been filming and the organisations whose job it is to protect them. I don't mean the refuge workers in this case, but the organisations. So I met a young woman called Wendy. She had been driven from her family home by a relationship that had been abusive and violent for many years. She finally fled with her 2 children. You can hear the fear in her voice in the 000 call she made the day she fled. She was very shy when I first met her, but very quickly decided that she wanted to take part. She said she'd Googled me and it was okay, she trusted me, and that she wanted to go ahead, and no matter what her husband did, no matter what the repercussions were, it was too important for her, and she wanted to get the message to other women living in toxic relationships that they must leave. Now, I compare her to the organisations who presented us with filming agreements, clearly that had been signed by other media organisations in the past, filming agreements that give them veto over what we film, filming agreements that say we will publish nothing that undermines the public trust in that organisation. Now, this is something that we have to push back against together as journalists. Now, there are entertainment programs being made on commercial television to make money. If they want to sign these agreements, that's fine, or that's maybe another question. But as journalists, we can't allow this to continue, that we sign up to veto, and that it's an expectation that the ABC, SBS, whoever, signs these agreements. When I started my reporting career in commercial television, I'm just thinking about how far things have come, even in a relatively short period of time. The first story I did for Channel 9 was in Paris. I went on the trail of Willy Brigitte. I don't know if you remember him. He was the Guadeloupean terrorist who'd been trained by the Pakistani terrorist organisation Lashkar-e-Toiba and come to Australia to commit a terrorist attack. So the story went. So I went to France and I got an interview with the deputy head of the domestic French intelligence service, the DST. Now, the night before the interview, I lay in my bed in Paris, trying to think of some way that I could elicit from him some grab that I could use, but with very low expectations that he would tell me anything. To be perfectly honest, I thought the way it would end, I would have a glamorous shot of me walking into the organisation, he would say something bland, and that would be that. As it turned out, I walked into the DST the next morning, walked into the office of the deputy director. There was a very large file on his desk. He said, "That is Willy Brigitte's file. Shall I just read it out to you on the camera?" So I tried to cover my surprise, but just imagine the same thing happening here. It's completely impossible. I don't mean to say by that that the DST is a model organisation. In the past, they had unsuccessfully tried to bug the French satirical newspaper Le Canard Enchaîné. So it's an organisation with a checkered history. Nonetheless, at that moment, they saw no danger in sharing with me the details of Brigitte's trip to Australia. As I say, it is impossible to imagine Duncan Lewis, the head of ASIO, ringing me up and asking me into ASIO for a similar kind of interview. Now, Michelle Grattan, you all know, she's written eloquently recently about the government's effectiveness in controlling access to images of the camps on Nauru and Manus. She said that with honourable exceptions, the media, starved of pictures, has neglected the story inside the camps. She's right. The chief executive of Transfield, which operates those offshore detention centres, and I know there's been a change in Nauru, we'll see how that goes, but a few months ago, Graham Hunt, who had a new contract with the government, was trying to open up Transfield to investors to hedge fund investors in order that Transfield should be transparent to the maximum extent possible so it could show investors that it was meeting its social and governance obligations. Now, this is during a period of a blanket ban on journalists visiting those camps. Now, the transparency that Graham Hunt was talking about didn't obviously extend to journalists, nor did it extend to people who'd escaped the war in Syria. There are 18 of them in Australian detention centres, and there's still very little known about them. The focus on the decision of Tony Abbott's decision to bring 12,000 refugees from the Middle East has been the focus of our attention. At the same time, the ABC decided to track down the 19th man, a man so broken by the prospect of permanent detention on Manus Island that he agreed to return to Syria. His name is Ayad. He said he made the decision intending to escape on the way back. He was arrested by the Jordanian authorities and put on a plane to Damascus. Arriving in Damascus from Manus Island, he might as well, as Ken Roth said, have had a sign around his neck saying, "I'm an opponent of Assad." He was tortured sporadically, he claims, and then finally goes back to Daraa, where his own village is being barrel-bombed by the Assad regime. Again, as Kenneth Roth said, I don't know anybody else who is taking asylum seekers and putting them in conditions so despairing that they choose the option of likely death or a very serious possibility of death to return home. The point about this is, it is deeply ironic, I think, that reporters who have been unable to penetrate the veil of secrecy that hung over the offshore detention centres in Nauru and Manus were only able to contact Ayad and get his story after he'd returned to the middle of the world's most brutal conflict. From criminal sanctions for reporting intelligence, from criminal sanctions for reporting intelligence, to silence over on-water matters, to threats of prosecution against detention centre whistleblowers, it seems to me that freedom of information is in danger of becoming another meaningless three-word slogan. And as I said before, it is for all of us to push back. I notice it more and more. It's not just Transfield, it's private companies. The story that I mentioned before with a 900-kilogram Brahmin steer. When I made a series of investigations about the live export trade, and in the first instance, the company involved pushed back after broadcast. They had the usual suspects, a couple of senators, a couple of dodgy scientists, prosecuting their case, but they were largely on the defensive. When it came to the second report on the live export trade, they were much better prepared. Before we went to air, their CEO, like Martin Winterkorn in Germany, recorded a statement to camera, his own version of what had happened, with no pesky questions from a journalist. They posted that on YouTube, and the ABC picked it up, and other media outlets. They used his quotes, his untested, unexamined quotes, as if they were part of an interview. It was very successfully done. A year later, someone linked to me the media strategy for that company on how they were going to control me, the language they were going to use, when they were going to release what information they used, and worst of all, the strategy of using other journalists to whom they would leak stories to undermine their stories, with a nice list of all the journalists who had taken their drops. As I say, we have to push back together. We have to push back against filming agreements. We have to push back on organisations who ask for questions in advance without shame. We have to push back on the PR companies, there you go, students, the PR companies who manage corporations in crisis, who give out little pieces of information, apparently giving you a sexy angle for a story. It can be, you can kid yourself that it's worth it just this once, but you're kidding yourself, it never is. Now, where does that leave us then, which is where I started? Where does that leave public broadcasting in this constrained, I would say, and highly politicised environment? In Britain, some influential people watching John Whittingdale's War on the Beeb are warning that it faces an existential threat. I spoke before about The Thick of It and Veep, the great works of Armando Iannucci. In fact, one of my real moments of pleasure that I was denied after watching The Killing Season, Alistair Campbell wrote a review of it in the voice of Malcolm Tucker, the great character from The Thick of It. If you don't know it, you should have a look. But Armando Iannucci recently gave the McTaggart Lecture at the Edinburgh Festival. And that lecture was really a rallying cry for the BBC. He described the BBC's immeasurable contribution to the culture of the United Kingdom and its status as one of the UK's biggest export industries. In fact, Iannucci said, if the BBC were a weapons system, half the cabinet of the UK would be on a plane to Saudi Arabia spruiking its benefits. But if the world's first and most powerful public broadcaster is in danger of having its wings clipped, what about us, its poorer cousin down under? We all know how often political trends, particularly in British politics, wash up on these shores sometime later. I wonder whether Armando Iannucci's cry to save the BBC is a message in a bottle for us. As the British government looks to narrow the scope of the BBC's role, to limit the degree to which it competes with commercial broadcasters, it's worth recalling the echoes of outrage here. Last November, News Limited's Julian Clark called on the government to stop the ABC, and I quote, using taxpayers' funds to compete against self-supported media companies in the digital space. Rather than pursuing a digital strategy, Mr. Clark opined, the public broadcaster should stick to knitting. In response, the then Prime Minister Abbott echoed Whittingdale's call for the public broadcaster to focus on delivering core services. This was, I think, a wider context for the accusations of ABC bias, of un-Australian behaviour, and for the Q&A scandal ABC of infamy headlines in News Limited tabloids. Then Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull stayed largely above the fray, quietly working to manage the Q&A crisis and stating that real innovation in digital media is within the ABC's charter. So this is my question to Malcolm Turnbull. He's Prime Minister now like his old friend David Cameron. Will he be tempted to follow the Tory lead in reining in the power of the public broadcaster, or will he be, as in the past, a friend of the ABC? Watch this space. Thank you.
Stay there because we'll have Q&A in a minute.
I'm just going to say one thing that I remember from the Tory party conference, which is that a few years ago, Ed Miliband, who was then leader of the British Labour Party, decided to go commando and make his speech without notes. It went brilliantly well, except he forgot the whole section on the economy. So while you talk, I'll just have a little look and see which my Ed Miliband sections are.
Well, I certainly didn't notice any. Anyway, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Margaret Simons. I'm Director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism, and I was the one responsible for pursuing this woman when she was virtually out of contact. I have to say, in a sign of the times, after contacting the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's public relations people, making numerous phone calls, and I think probably hundreds of emails, what finally got Sarah's attention was a tweet. And she got back to me almost immediately, for which I'm very glad. I think we've had a lecture in the best traditions of the A.N. Smith. It has been both particular and wide-ranging, both optimistic but also a warning, and of course for the journalists among us and the journalism students, a call to arms. So I'd like to say thank you very much, Sarah, for a great lecture. We do have about a little less than 10 minutes for questions. I would ask those of you who want to ask questions, please do wait for the microphone. It's not just about the audience being able to hear you, it's also about the fact that we're recording this lecture to make it available for the public and for journalism students in future generations. So please do wait for the microphones, there's a couple circulating. Please do make it questions, not speeches. And of course, as I've just said, remember that the session is being recorded. So do we have a question? Okay, there's a gentleman there.
Thank you. I've got two very quick questions and then a bit of a comment from you, if I may. Just what's his name? Albo Albanese, and there was another politician too, ripping off or plagiarising speeches word for word from a movie. I mean, where's that coming from? But I'd like you to elaborate for me a bit on Julia Gillard, because I sort of was still a bit of a fan of hers. And when she was overseas, you know, Obama just loved her, and people overseas couldn't understand why she wasn't treated well here. And I've always felt that when she was hung to Parliament, or when she, you know, people didn't understand that she had to negotiate with the Greens and the Independents and that, and she did that really well. And I don't think she was ever given credit for that. Am I waffling?
It's always the case, isn't it, that people overseas don't understand the terrible nature of domestic politics. Whenever you hear accounts of world leaders getting together, they all laugh about the awful situations they have at home. So I don't think that's unusual. The thing about, there are a whole series of questions to be answered about Julia Gillard, and I think it comes back to what I said about the draw of the series, was because the great shock of what happened in 2010 to Kevin Rudd was not properly explained. It's something that she conceded at the time, that move was made, an extraordinary move in Australian politics, although now with its successor, but in a very different set of dynamics. But it was the failure to explain, I think, that left all of those questions unanswered. It's much too complicated to give an account of Julia Gillard, but I think she acknowledges that particular failure. She acknowledges the problem of her statements about climate change being devastating to her. And I think that whatever you think about in relation to the way she was treated, she would also expect you to ask serious questions about the politics, to consider the nature of how she was treated, which we did, but also to consider the straight political questions. Julia Gillard was very clear in her political career that she wanted to be taken seriously as a politician, and I think it's our job to respect that and consider what happened to her, both in the larger sense about the nature of the country at the time, but the straight political questions, and that's, I think, what we tried to do.
Another question in the middle here? Yes, just here.
In a future programme series on the Abbott government and its legacy, you may recall he made an outrageous gaffe making a comparison between ISIS and the Nazis, and said that the Nazis had a sense of shame about what happened in the camps. So that could segue into a question about whether he and his government felt any shame about what happened to all the people on Manus Island and Christmas Island, and that is why there is this huge, not veil, but curtain of secrecy over everything happening there.
I think that's a very interesting question. I think what history makes of that will be the question. You know, I wouldn't dream to be a proxy for them or to understand their motivation, but how history judges that. But I think that Michelle Grattan's point was a very important one. I could sense in the media, and I include myself in this, a wearying around that topic. So even though I'd spent a lot of time in that field making programs about smugglers, but also about asylum seekers, that we really failed when it came to Nauru and Manus. And I wanted to make this point to journalists, actually. This is something that I failed to manage, but it's just a question. If you want to be an investigative journalist, you have to think very carefully about ever having your face known. There are so many things I could do now that I would like to do in relation to those great stories of our time, and that was certainly one of them. But you can't do them once people know who you are. You look at some of the great investigative reporters working in Africa and South America and in Europe, and anonymity is crucial to them. So if you're a journalist thinking of investigative journalist as your stream, keep your face off Facebook, keep your face off Twitter, and keep your face off the TV, and then the world is yours.
And now we've got the gentleman there, and then you.
Hi. Sorry. With the toppling of the Rudd government, and the Gillard government and the Abbott government, the Rudd government renowned for its announceables, the Gillard government for the rebranding of Gillard, and for the Abbott government for the three-word slogans. Do you think that the population is becoming more media savvy? Is this the effect of spinning and the spin doctors and the Malcolm Tuckers? Are they becoming less effective now?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I was talking to Tony Mitchellmore, the Labour marketeer, this morning about that very topic. He's just done a series of focus groups in Western Sydney, and he says that people are just extraordinary. They will see the strategy before they answer. They'll see and describe the strategy in a political campaign before they'll tell you what they think about the people involved. There is no question that people are savvy to it. So what happens next, I'm not sure, but maybe it's too late. Maybe we're in a post-marketing world. I hope so.
I'm afraid this will have to be the last question, and it's the gentleman there.
Laurie Oakes, in a press freedom dinner recently here in Melbourne, said that one of his main concerns was the creeping legislation, which relates particularly in the megadata area and relates to the fact that it is increasingly a possibility developing in Australia that journalists may be in a position where they refuse to reveal their sources under Media Alliance ethics, but they may be forced through legislation, forced into a court, and may face a serious court situation if they don't reveal their major sources. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, Laurie is right to campaign, and in fact, again, in the same way that I think we should push back on the things that I talked about questions being asked in advance, about filming, drafts of filming agreements being put together by lawyers. This is probably the biggest threat that we face. And the work of the MEAA is important, but I think we have to get beyond that. We have to mount a much bigger campaign. I don't think the public realises how big a threat to journalism that is. Without the source, we are nothing. While I don't like people quoting off the record sources are everything. So you're absolutely right. Laurie is right. And anybody who's remotely engaged in this space needs to be part of that campaign, and perhaps that's something that we should talk about.
Indeed, yes, I couldn't agree more. Well, look, I'm afraid we are out of time. It falls to me, first of all, just to thank a couple of people from within the university, particularly Tamsin Courtney and Anders Furs, without whom this would not be happening, and also a lot of other people from the university and the Faculty of Arts. Thanks very much for all your efforts. But most of all, I want to thank our lecturer. I think it's been a terrific evening. I'm just going to have to come around here in order to get a couple of gifts.
A subscription to The Age. How marvellous.
Somewhat in keeping with the tenor of the past as a lessons for the future, we have the front page of a newspaper on the day of your birth.
How fantastic. What a clever idea.
It is talking about a US peace pledge to Pope. So anyway, I hope you enjoy reading what was going on when you were born, Sarah. And also another gift as well that you can unwrap at your leisure.
The last hanging in Australia, and a story about housing, Back to the Future. Fantastic.
And another gift as well. Thank you. So please join me in thanking this year's ANC.